Okay, so we now move to the Central City Landmark Heritage Grant. Now we have two of these today, and what I'm proposing is that we do the discussion and questions for each of them before we move to the resolutions for each of them. But initially, Brendan's going to talk us through the grant itself, why it's there, and then introduce.
Yeah, I'd just like to go through the original intent and the purpose of the landmark scheme for your information, so that councillors who may not be familiar with it are made sort of aware of what it was about. And there are sort of three areas. There's the initial paragraph that's in both reports, 4.7, which covers the sort of the general history of the grant. But in addition to that, I think it's worth making a few points that we covered off in a review a couple of years ago, but again, you weren't all made aware of that necessarily. The original scheme was based on our current Heritage Incentive Grant scheme, but it had a different focus, and the focus was definitely on the central city to retain heritage buildings, significant landmark buildings that are very important in terms of retaining the sense of place and the identity of the whole city, in effect. And that was something that was seen very important as part of regeneration. These are anchor buildings in many respects, that they tie you to the sense of place and the original and the unique sense of place of Christchurch. And that was the focus, because we lost 50% of our heritage buildings in the central city, which is incredibly devastating in terms of your identity and your sense of uniqueness. So the intent was to make a material difference to that loss of heritage buildings by offering incentives to building owners to, instead of seeking the easy path in many cases to demolish a building, that they actually sought to retain and repair and seismically upgrade the building and to find a new use for it. That's quite a task for a building owner to take on. So the grants were seen as a real incentive to do that. The second point really is that, and it relates to our strategy. One of the key findings from the heritage strategy was that funding is seen by the community as a very important tool to preserve heritage and to conserve the buildings and the sense of place and identity that we've got. And it all fits into the creation of a vibrant and vital central city, which all chips into recovery and earthquake regeneration. And the final point, which I'd just like to emphasise, is that often council support is a real trigger mechanism to free up other funding. And without council support, the developers tell us that they really struggle to unlock the bank vaults, basically, and go and say to people, look, help us to fund this project. And usually the first thing that the bank says, well, have you got council support, or is there any additional funding? So we encourage people to seek other funding sources, obviously. EQIP and the Ministry of Culture and Heritage, both of these buildings have been the subject of applications to other funding sources with varying degrees of success. The other final point, is as well that often the availability of grant funding can accelerate the process of recovery, and buildings that may have been just mothballed for quite a few years, we can accelerate the works by offering an incentive grant, in effect, to get the work underway as quickly as possible. And that has been pretty effective in the case of a number of the buildings that we've looked at. The initial list included probably about 12 buildings, and the list that you've got in the two reports clearly shows that a lot of those buildings have now been successfully repaired, seismically upgraded, and they are contributing back to the fabric of the city and to the vitality and the recovery of the city. So those are key points that maybe don't get covered in the initial reports for these two buildings. The two buildings that are up, 116 Worcester and 96 Lichfield, very similar buildings in terms of their scale and their sort of era, one from the 1920s, one from the 1930s, and the various issues that the developers have to deal with, finding a new use. Both of these buildings are not owned by the original owners who were in ownership at the time of the earthquake. So they've been bought, so there's no insurance funds available for these buildings. So these are people who've come in and they want to regenerate and they want to save these buildings. They haven't just been saddled with them because they owned them before the earthquakes. So they've taken a risk. So the other, I think the reports pretty much can be taken as read, but I just felt it was important to make those initial points about the scheme, just to make sure that you're aware of all that behind, because this has been going for 10 years, nearly 10 years, and as I say, the list really does show that it's been incredibly effective at getting things underway and keeping the momentum going for recovery.
That's great, thank you. And next year is the last year of the grant fund currently?
Yeah, as it says there, the initial funding put aside for landmarks was 2.7. That was has been reduced over the years down to 1.9, and now it's 1.5 million per annum. And the last year of funding is scheduled for next year. So the remaining funds for this year are 1.2 million. So these two grants combined do require you to pre-allocate some funding from next year, if the preferred option is taken as the approved option.
Thank you
but
very
there are
much.
obviously other options that you can consider.
We've got a few questions here. So we've got Mike, Andrew, Pauline, and Sam.
Thank you. I've raised this a number of times that this has happened where we're going into the next year's budget, and it does concern me. And obviously you put forward the second option, which is not your preferred one of the lower grant, would actually, those two, if at the lower option, would exhaust it and not go into next annual budget. My question is, have you actually discussed with the owners of the building what amount they would require from council to actually get this project moving?
I have discussions, quite a lot of discussions, particularly with the Wellington Woolen Mills building at 96 Lichfield. They, as I say, they bought the building as a I suppose some sort of a challenge investment, and they've been really, I think they've possibly been underestimating the difficulties, how you actually have to deal with a building like this, particularly on the facade. So they've been talking to me frequently about what we can do to assist their funding, because they're meeting costs that they didn't anticipate to have to get the best result for the facade, in particular the one that faces Lichfield Street. This is a marble facade. It requires particular delicate treatment, and yes, they could do a cheaper option, and they could do a lower quality option for repairing the building, because there is no requirement to do a lot of the work that they're doing. It's to get a better outcome in the long term. It's good for them to do the work, because obviously it means they get a maintenance-free building. But the grants are a key component in order for them to go to other funders.
I guess you're not quite answering my question. If we were to, say, do 600,000, would this stop the actual work going here? Because when I look through the options matrix, everything's identical between the two options. The only thing that's not is the very last point where it says it's not consistent as previous grants. So I think, even if you look at the fund, it's been reduced over time. So I don't think the fact that it's not consistent is the reason not to grant the lower option. So I guess if we were to go for option 2 and grant 600,000, so therefore not go into the next budget, would that stop the work from happening? Because looking at the report in front of me, it won't stop the work from happening.
Yeah, I can't answer that exactly, because I don't know. Would a grant of only 600 work? Possibly, I don't know. I mean, ideally, they are looking for a similar level of funding to other developers in the city.
And I don't think that's a reason to grant it. And my concern is if we went to 900 for this one, then technically the next one's we're looking at 300 if we want to stick within this budget we've currently set, because we have an annual plan to go through and we don't know what the outcome of that will be in terms of the whole grant itself. So when we look at the two, would a better outcome, if we stayed within the 1.2 million, would the better outcome be 600 for each or 900 and 300? And then which would be the better one to fund 900?
I don't think it's right to give one more than the other.
Okay.
And what I've tried to do with the consideration of next year's funding as well is to think, okay, there's another 1.5 million. I'm asking for pre-allocation of 600,000. That leaves you again $900,000 in the potential fund for next year, assuming that's approved.
But the thing is, we haven't made a decision technically on that. So
and I understand that.
That's fine. You've answered my question.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Great. Next is Andrew, then Pauline, then Sam, then Jake.
Thank you. So, I mean, my question, Mike possibly has answered. But what I'm hearing, and maybe I'm just asking you to reiterate it, is that if we were to go with 600,000 for each, you don't know that would be sufficient. You talked about in the answer some differences of finish or quality or outcome, but you don't know that at 600,000 the project would still proceed. I mean, I guess what I'm concerned about is at 600,000, would that be enough for the building owner to walk away and say we're just not doing this?
Well, yes, it may. I mean, they may be anticipating greater funding than that, having seen other funding approvals in the past. So they may have factored that amount of funding into their equation. I don't know exactly. All that I can see is what they're envisaging spending. The total investment that this grant will generate for the 160, for the 96 Litchfield Street one, they're going to be spending at least $2.5 million just on the facade. Just on the facade, and then an additional, I think it's about $4.5 million on the seismic upgrading of the building beyond the facade. That's the kind of costs that we're looking at. These are not easy fixes, because you're dealing with facade. In this case, it's a 100-year-old facade from the 1920s. You're having to fix delicate stonework and the first example of curtain wall glazing. So the costs are very significant for them. As I say, probably a total of something in the region of $8 to $9 million on the. And that doesn't include the actual initial purchase cost of the building.
Of course, yeah.
The 116 Worcester, I asked them for a summary in the same kind of light, and they're envisaging spending $3 million on the facade, and then an additional $6 million on strengthening the back of the building. Their total costs for the project, they estimate in the region of $25 million. So there's a huge amount of investment involved in these projects, which these grants are important to trigger, to allow them to progress. So a smaller grant relative to what others have been getting in the past, it may not achieve the outcome that we're after. They may not be able to raise as much funding from other sources if we don't give them this funding. But it's always a little bit grey, but these are triggering huge amounts of investment.
Yeah.
And one of the other key things that they made the point to me in their response yesterday, is that once they do this work, the rateable value of their building will go up from something in the region of 15,000 to 170,000 per annum. That's what they're estimating.
Yeah.
So the grant funds, in effect, will be returned relatively quickly.
I understand all of that. Is whether we can achieve the same with 900,000 as we could with 600,000 as we could with 900. And the short answer from everything you've said is we don't know.
Yeah, I just don't know that, but I'm
Okay.
trying.
Could
Might
we
just-
take a tranche 1, tranche 2 approach? So if there was an unwillingness to go into next year's funding, given that we haven't gone through the completed the annual plan process yet, could we take an approach where we were to grant the 600,000 to each now, and then allow them, or allow us to consider after the 1st of July the balance, the 300,000 for each, realising that the 600,000 might be sufficient to give them confidence, and they might be able to, you know, they might start the work, they might get on with it anyway, or if the 300,000 was actually such a make or break component of the funding, obviously they'd have the knowledge that the 600 have been granted. They may want to wait for a further decision on the 300 before they went past any point of no return. Would that be a possibility?
I think that would be a really good possibility. I understand that, yes, the reluctance to commit to funding in the future year. I certainly understand that.
Okay, that leads to a third and final question from me. What other buildings have been considered, or are there any other buildings been actively considered for the funding for the 2021 year, assuming that remains in place after the annual plan process?
Yeah, we have probably 2 other buildings that were on the list for being candidates. One of them, actually, oddly, is one that we actually approved funding for, but then the grant lapsed because of various insurance issues, and that was Victoria Mansions.
Yep.
And that's come back on the agenda now. So I'm getting inquiries from the it's the same owner, but they've just got different intentions for the building now, and they're coming back saying, could you still give us some funding? There's the Peterborough Centre, which is another one that we've looked at funding, and the other possible candidate would be the Arts Centre, where they've got a number of buildings which could be perfectly eligible for funding. From a construction point of view, if they came to us and said, look, we'd like to fix this particular building, yes, we could offer a grant for that building.
All right, so
So
just
the-
leading on from that, and this is my final question. If all of that came good, if all of that came good, and if the funds that are currently in the LTP were confirmed through the annual plan, would that mean that next year's fund would likely be oversubscribed?
Probably not. I think one of those are likely to go, and not necessarily all of them.
Okay.
So that's what I envisage, trying to sort of
We did this last time.
divide up the remaining funding that we've got, the 1.2 from this year plus the 1.5 from next year, and look at that. Well, that gives you 2.7 divided by 3, gives you a good high amount to make a difference, and it would be fair to.
Carolyn has been working with the Arts Centre.
Yeah.
I think the question was if all 3 of those buildings came through next financial year. I just want to clarify your question.
So,
Did you say if all 3
well, I guess it.
came through, would that oversubscribe the fund? Because I just want to clarify that, because I think if the council were thinking of funding at the house level of funding, then the amount of funding that would be available would oversubscribe the fund. If all 3 buildings came through, Brendan was talking about if one of those
Yeah.
came through,
Yeah.
an example.
So you're saying if all 3 came through, then it would be oversubscribed. But Brendan obviously has made some comment about the possibility that not all 3 would come through.
Yeah.
So I'm just making that clarification.
It's good to have all of that context. All of those answers have been really useful. Thank you.
And Andrew, that's largely because one of them, one owner owns 2 of those buildings.
Yes.
So,
Yeah.
so they're likely to go with one next year.
Yeah.
Not both.
Yeah.
Right, well, so we've got a long question list. So if questions have already been asked, please don't please don't repeat them. Pauline, then Sam, then Jake, then Jimmy.
Yeah, just on what amount of time do people have to pick up this grant?
18 months.
18
so that's
months,
standard.
okay. And we talk about possibly 600 each or something like that. What about 700 and 500? Would that be more of a goer, do you think? Because you
No,
talk
no.
about the concern that it's not enough to actually incentivise it, so it might not help. So, you know, just wondering if
Yeah.
7 rather than 9 and 5 rather than...
I'd say it's a bit vague what exactly would act as an incentive. So, what would be the threshold for them to make the decision? I think they're actually very similar buildings, and that's what I said initially. And they're the same status in the district plan. One is slightly higher relative to Heritage New Zealand, but that's as a result of it having a fairly unique for its time curtain wall glazing system. But in terms of their contribution to the urban identity and
Yeah.
the cityscape, they're very similar,
Yeah.
and they would have similar effects in terms of rejuvenation of the central city. Both of them will accommodate living accommodation, and that's one of the goals of getting the city back
Yes, true. Yeah.
as a
Yeah, so your
as a vibrant
recommendation
place.
is 900 for one and 600 for the other over a 2-year period, and that's what you think is the best option?
No, my recommendation is to keep them consistent, 900 each, but that does involve you pre-allocating some for next year, and then another 900,000 is left for next year. That's the kind of division of the numbers, because I say they're very similar buildings, and the costs associated with each of them are roughly the same. They're talking about 9 million in construction for both buildings, because they've got difficult facades and quite complex seismic upgrade requirements.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, Sam then Jake.
Thank you. Just two quick ones. Firstly, I was interested in your comments in terms of these aren't obviously the original owners post-earthquake. So presumably they've bought these at a value that reflects what it will cost them to develop them.
Mm-hmm.
So that will be factored into the price.
Yes,
surely?
yes, but,
Yeah, okay.
but as I say, it's just to make that point that there is no pot of insurance money that's waiting to be
No,
gathered.
but
These
that
are,
would be reflected into
Yep.
the price they
In-
bought them
yep.
for. Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, and the second one, and just for my clarification, so in terms of the district plan and them being significant, how difficult would it be for them to be demolished?
they're highly significant. They're in the top of the two groups that we've got. Yes, they could apply for a resource consent for demolition, but they would have to make a very strong case that there are no options to repair and retain the building.
Right, cool. Thank you, that's great.
Thank you, Jake. Okay, thank you. Jimmy.
Discussing them
Yeah,
together, aren't
we'll
we?
get to that, but Jake has indicated that he'd like to move. So
I'd happy to
we'll
second
see
it.
where we get to.
Yep.
Okay,
We're not
thank
quite
you.
up to that
Thank
yet,
you.
so we're not going to.
Okay,
Yeah,
Thank you, Chair.
Jimmy.
I would like to follow Andrew's question. You reply to him next year. Have another 2 additional building will be applied for, but we review the paragraph 5.7. Next one, is the kind of the state insurance building. So you separate. This year is 300K. Next year is for 600K. Am I right? So whether this one of them, what is another one?
Well, in terms of next year,
Yeah.
that I think there's likely to be at least one more application for next year, but I can't be sure that there isn't going to be another one. But when we looked at this fund initially, we had about 12 buildings on there, and most of those buildings have now been dealt with either through the funding of them to get the repair underway, and you've got the list there. There are a couple of odd ones that kind of slipped through, like Victoria Mansions, which had funding, and then for whatever reasons the work didn't occur. That I'm anticipating coming back next year. So if we were to give a similar level of funding to that building, we could do that from the original from the remaining funds that would be left, even with these 2 being approved at 900.
Yeah, this is my concern. Sorry, Chair. This is my sub-question. Because while every year, we have year by year have an annual plan, even once every 3 years, a long-term plan. Probably we are aware, those are central city landmark, have the building, who they are. Probably you need to put on those long-term plan, annual plan, you are fully aware. Because, but you presented to the council is case by case applicant. So for us, difficult to understand whether have some other also landmark have the building. If we grant funding like 900K or 600K, if we get 900K, probably the opportunity cost, the other one miss out. So whether it's possible for us aware, all this year or coming year, how many the rest are belong to this kind of heritage building. Then this also one factor we need to consider.
Yeah, but the other factor to consider is that these two buildings are ready to go. Basically, the owners have bought the buildings and they've invested already in terms of their purchasing, and they've got consultants on board, and they're keen to actually see these buildings repaired, and they're asking for our support to do that. They're ready now. So there are potentially other buildings, of course, but I don't know how long they may sit on the shelf before somebody actually comes along and says, yeah, we're ready to go with that now. It's better to support the ones that are ready, and that was the intention of the scheme, to support buildings where owners have got the sort of the impetus to start and to come and contact us and get on with the work and accelerate the recovery. Yes, there may be other ones further down, but that's the unknown. We have to deal really with the ones that are here ready to go now.
Thanks for that, Jimmy. Then we have James Goff.
Thank you. And you certainly don't need to convince me of the merits of heritage and growing the rating base and everything. But look, do you get the owner? If you just help me understand, it's more around the methodology, Brendan. But do you get the owner to provide a breakdown of the costings associated with the refurbishment? And if so, in the future, is that something that could be provided to us? And what methodology is then applied from a staff perspective on reaching the figure that you recommend?
Yes, I do. I've got them there. It gets very complicated. So what I try and do is to just give you the summary. These are not the same as heritage incentive grants, where we're looking at very specific items. These are big projects where even with our funding, the resources are only going to be a relatively small part of the overall cost. But certainly, I do get a scope of works basically from the building owner. What do you need to do? And most of it is on seismic upgrading work, but with these two buildings, it's on the facades.
Is that something that would be appropriate, and take your guidance here to include that?
I just think it'd bog you down in the details. I mean, even a relatively simple summary of the work is pretty complicated. But you're welcome to look at
I
that.
just think when it's public money, though, and they're coming to the council for that public money, that it's possibly could be part of the deal.
I could certainly provide it. Like I say, I've got them here.
Okay,
So
that's fine, and I appreciate it, and thanks for your work.
Thank you. Mike?
I'll just foreshadow option 2, so we have a way forward if this Jake's one doesn't pass.
Okay. Any further questions, Yanni?
Yeah, there was money from the Earthquake Appeal Trust that was left over for heritage, as I understood it. So are we applying to I don't know who sits on that or what relationship we have, but we did previously get briefed on that being used for heritage projects. Has anyone contacted Otakaro or government or that appeal trust?
Yes, we have. We've been in contact with the Earthquake Appeal Trust. They had a smaller amount of money left over, and you would have seen from the information that came out that has been assigned to the Band Rotunda, and that was their choice of where the money should go.
Right. Okay. And so basically there's no opportunity now for any more central government funding towards heritage?
They have allocated all their money. If something, that's what they've advised us. They've allocated all their money.
Right.
What we have advised them to do is obviously contact the Ministry of Culture and Heritage and to investigate applying for the Equip Fund. But that only gives you funding up to 34% MBS. If you want to go beyond that, that's on you as a separate sort of project.
Councillor Johansson, you've raised that with us before, and so the staff do ensure that they are giving messages to applicants to both this fund and the Heritage Incentive Grant Fund to make sure that they are looking at other sources beyond council.
Yeah, I mean, the story seems to be council puts lots of money in for heritage, central government, even though it's in the regeneration plan for the central city as being important, puts almost nothing in, and we pick up the cost.
Yeah.
Really?
Well, if they're successful with a heritage, with an equip application, they could get up to 400,000. But that's the ministry's various.
And I sense from your previous answers that some of these aren't actually very successful in getting central government funding.
Only because generally people want to do more than 34%.
Right.
They want to get
It's
to a higher level.
That's fair enough.
Yeah.
It's oversubscribed nationally.
Yeah.
We have supported them. There's a building in Littleton that we wrote letters of support, and they've obtained money from the Equip Fund as well. So.
Thank you. I'm just going to clarify a couple of things before Melanie. You mentioned at one point that one of these buildings you thought that maybe 25 million, and then later on you said 9 million?
9 million for the construction costs, but what they've planned for, they're going to actually make a building which includes the interior of the building to
Right.
meet a particular use. That whole cost, what they're anticipating in their whole project, is around the 25 million mark. So that's construction, purchase, and the fit out of the building,
Okay.
because it's going to be living accommodation.
Yep. And prior to the long-term plan, the last long-term plan, we had a couple of buildings come up for grants. And at that point, there was no further landmark heritage grant. At that point, it was planned to be the last. And one of the questions was, are there any other buildings coming up? And the answer was none that we know of, so you may as well spend it now, pretty much. And then we've had another series of sort of years of buildings. Is the intent to put a bid in for more landmark heritage grant funding in the long-term plan, or is this it? Because that makes a difference between if we're looking at all of the buildings we've got left and that are potentially coming to us, and this is all the funding that is currently in the budget, that might make it a, you know.
We're not looking for an extension, because as I say, if you go back to the original intention, there was about 12 buildings on the list that were seen as the fundamental anchor buildings.
Yeah.
And most of them have been kind of dealt with.
Yeah. So the landmark heritage grant has kind of done its job. At this point, we have a small amount of money, several million left at this point over 2 years. And these are the projects you're currently recommending them for.
Yeah, there's 2.7 million left if you include next year.
Yeah, and if and the 5 that have been mentioned today, the 2 that are actually applications and the potential other 3, if we're looking at allocating funding across those 5, if they came through, which would be the priorities? So Victoria mentioned, I think, was in the original list of 12.
Yeah, the 2 that, as I said to Councillor Chen, the ones that are ready to go, the ones that are definites, these will happen if we encourage them. The 116 Worcester, they will be cracking on with that work. 96 have actually already started in terms of they're doing the clear out of the interior so that they can design what they need to do, or at least assess what they need to do inside there.
Yeah. And so both of these projects are purchased, they're ready to go, they've started work. Our money allows them to do stuff in a better way than they might have otherwise.
Yes.
In these projects, they would still do up these buildings, and the buildings would still remain even without our grants.
Yeah, you would potentially get a refurbished building, but you might not get a refurbished facade to the same degree that you would get now.
But the facades are protected though, aren't they?
They are, but that's not quite the same as having a really good quality repair.
No, that's fine.
You know,
okay.
That's the difference. Is they don't have to do some of the work that they're proposing, but it's in the interest of the building and the city to get that work done now.
Cool, thank you. Melanie?
My question was just around like funding that doesn't get used, like for Victoria mentioned. So does that just
That came back in, and we reallocated it to the
Okay.
to the former CBS building, so
Okay,
that the same
good.
funding was redistributed to
Right.
another landmark building.
Any last questions? No, well, so we have a mover and seconder in Jake and Pauline for the staff recommendation. We'll just deal with we will deal with the actual resolutions one at a time. Before we do, you guys completely comfortable with that? And did you want either of them contingent on annual plan decisions? Or are you happy for us to be reallocating money from next year's budget? Okay, so for both of those, that's fine. So that's moved and seconded. We do have a foreshadowed motion, which is option 2, which is $600,000 each, not going into next year's annual plan allocation. So if this first one fails, then we will move to that. But we will do that for item 12 and then item 13. So, or is it 11 then 12? Yep, 12 then 13. Okay.
Sorry, Chair.
Yep.
I can tell this one is this year budget rather than next year. The
That's
other,
correct.
the insurance building, that's close the next year, am I right?
That's currently,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
that's the
Just
staff
want to
recommendation.
confirm, Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
So we've got a staff recommendation. Jamie, do you need a bit of time to have a look at those? Yeah.
What time's lunch? Have we got a lunch break?
Yeah.
Carolyn?
Yes. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
When they come into contracting stuff and things, yeah, that's fine. Yeah. Okay, so we're going to do item 12, and we have a staff recommendation that's been moved by Jake and seconded by Pauline. If this fails, we'll move to the foreshadowed motion, which is for $600,000. So that's how we'll do this process, and then we will move to item 13 and go through the same thing. Item 13's foreshadowed one will be dependent on the outcome of this one. Is that right? Yep. Okay. Right. So, any debate? Andrew, then Sam, then Pauline.
Thank you. This is difficult, and the answers to the questions were particularly useful for me in forming an opinion of how I was going to approach this. I've publicly commented that I'll look at all ways of reducing rates between now and the final adoption of the annual plan, and as a council we've indicated a clear intention to do exactly that. So having made that commitment, much as I want the very best outcome for these buildings, I find it difficult to think of pre-committing funding from next year's allocation, realising that we could end up dealing with an amendment through the annual plan that could actually change the availability of funding next year from what's currently indicated in the LTP. So if we're serious about reducing rates, we shouldn't really be taking any options to do that off the table at this time. And of course, such an amendment could be an option as we go through the annual plan process. I'm also concerned, having heard about the other buildings that we potentially could be considering in the next year, assuming the funding is confirmed through the annual plan, that we end up putting ourselves in exactly the same position next year of having more candidate buildings than we've got funds. So we're kind of paying a problem forward in some ways if we were to approve the 2x900 today. As we come towards the end of this fund, and as we anticipate that there might be other contenders for the remainder of the fund in the queue, and that some of those could end up missing out, it's realistic that we take a different approach to this than we have when we've been faced with a similar problem in the past. I understand all the arguments that these buildings are ready to go, and I understand and I absolutely appreciate that there's a significant amount of private money and commitment on the part of building owners in purchasing these buildings and in planning to restore them to a high standard. I wish I felt able to support the 900 for each, because I understand the value of heritage, totally understand the value of heritage, and the value that heritage buildings that have already been funded from this fund have brought to the city. But with the current focus on rates restraint through the annual plan process and coming into the LTP, I find it difficult looking at these two cases to do that this time. So I won't be supporting the 900 for each, but I'll indicate that if we get to that point, I would be happy to support the foreshadowed motion for each of 600,000.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Sam?
Yeah, thank you. It's not very often I say it, but I almost entirely agree with Andrew on that stuff. Look, in my view, I actually won't be supporting what's up there, or the foreshadowed motion, and I do admit I'm new to this, but in my view, there was only one point that really stood out, and that was the fact that these had been bought after the insurance was paid out. And so that is the crux of this. The reality is that was factored into the purchase price, so I don't think we should be using ratepayer money to do it. In my view, there are far more pressing issues, and I actually look in terms of heritage, and I agree with what Jamie said in his questions. You know, I completely respect heritage in Christchurch, but I think if we are concentrating that funding, it probably should be somewhere like the Arts Centre. So in my view, I can't support either that motion or the foreshadow today.
Thank you very much. Pauline?
Oh yeah, look, we set up this this grant to incentivise and to accelerate the restoration of these beautiful buildings, and we have lost 50% of them. And I think that because we've heard there is an element of risk, if we water this amount down too much, it's not going to actually do any good. We've got to keep with these big chunks. I think the annual plan thing, if that pans out in a different way than we expect, we'll have to cross that bridge when we come to it. But at the moment, I think it's really worth supporting the staff recommendation, because I think we've got to take guidance from these guys who absolutely know what they're doing. We've got to look at as Andrew said, these are ready to go. That's a really key ingredient to this. They're ready to go, and they're going to provide inner city living, which we're desperate for. So I think this is a good use of ratepayer money, and I really do encourage councillors to support this today. I certainly will be.
Thanks, Pauline. James?
Kia ora. Look, I fully support what Councillor McDonald has said. I have a real issue with these properties being bought, knowing what the issues were when they purchased them, and so to incentivise or subsidise, whatever word you want to use, I don't agree with it, and I will not be supporting either the motion as it sits or the foreshadowed motion.
Kia ora, thank you. Any further before I ask Jake to no? Jimmy?
If no, the kind of next the application, the state insurance building, probably I would like to go this one, staff recommendation. But I'm still concerned because council budget all from the ratepayer, then we make decision. We need to consider, maybe equally opportunity give those the kind of the application. Particularly these two are the kind of building are all under the Central City landmark heritage. The building are all significant, all important. Why I support foreshadow? If we support foreshadow 600K, then next one is equally 600K. Then we don't need to assume the annual plan will approve this one not, because if we do the next one. Actually, if we go to the 900K, but we only have 300K, then next year, new year, we put a consultation, a moment's consultation time period. We cannot presume, those 600K we approve. I consider and concern those the kind of sequence of the process, consider consultation process. So I would like to support the foreshadow rather than the staff recommendation.
James?
Yeah, I'll keep this brief. Look, the fund was set up for a reason. From my personal perspective, I'd actually like to see some alterations made to the policy. I think there might be an appetite to relook at some of the criteria and the prioritisation within that. But we heard a deputation this morning, and I think one of the first words that came up in their first deputation was around equity and equality. And I think people are okay with things not being even so long as they're fair. Now, the place to amend the policy, if you disagree with it, is the LTP. I think all the private sector or all anyone wants is clear rules of engagement, and I think moving the goalpost midstream is quite confused quite a confused message to send from a council. So would I like to see changes in the application of this policy? Yes, I would, and I believe the perfect place for that is the LTP, which we just conveniently happen to be rolling into pretty soon. So I will support it, just because I think changing the goalpost midstream is a confused way to operate from the city's governors.
Melanie?
Well, I'm generally against the idea of giving public money to private individuals. However, these are heritage buildings, and I believe heritage is incredibly important, especially in Christchurch. So basically I'll be supporting it, and if you do the maths on the rates increase that we'll get the money back, and I don't know, I haven't done the maths, but it will be pretty quick. So I will definitely be supporting the recommendation we're looking at now.
Anyone further before? Yep, Mike.
Thank you. I won't be supporting the current motion. I think, $600,000 is a lot of money, ratepayers' money, on top of obviously already a heritage grant for the cathedral, on top of heritage incentive grants. Yes, heritage is important, but so is the pockets of the ratepayers. And I just don't think it's wise to start going into next year's budget when we have a current amount in front of us of $1.2 million. We have two options, 900 or 600, and it's very clear actually when you look through the matrix that everything is pretty much the same apart from an option 2. It's not consistent with previous grants. But actually this is the environment we're working in, and this is the total amount we have. If we do allocate 900 to both, we're already dipping into the next year's budget, which we haven't even decided on because we haven't been through the annual plan. And I've had 2 councillors actually question the actual need for this this grant. So actually there is discussion to be had. And if we did do the full $1.8 million, suddenly we've got another 3 heritage buildings that are going to get way less than $600,000 if they all come through. So I think you should just think a little bit carefully about what actually happens if you do grant $900,000 to these ones, if you're trying to actually activate heritage restoration to some of the significant buildings in the central city.
Just before you close off, sorry, I know you've done that like 4 times now. I think one of the important things to note here is that the fact of this grant and the annual allocation for it was consulted on with the community as part of our last long-term plan, and the community agreed and the council decided to allocate this funding. So what we're doing today is we're deciding how the allocation that's already been made and consulted on will be spent. Having said that, we do have another consultation coming up, and I'm not happy to go into next year's budget, so I'll be looking for the foreshadowed motion so that we don't go into those. Kia ora, Jake.
I was just going to say 2 firsts, me agreeing with Councillor Goff and Sam agreeing with Councillor Turner. I agree, consistency is key here, and I think further to Mike's point, it's highly unlikely in the staff view that all 3 of those buildings will come and seek funding from us in the next financial year. It's, in my view, unlikely that this fund will be oversubscribed at the end of the next financial year, and in a city that's lost so much heritage, I think that it is important that we prioritise a really good heritage outcome on these 2 buildings.
That I will put the motion. Those in favour of the staff recommendation, please say aye. Aye. Those against? No. Probably a division. I'm going to say that's lost. Does anyone want to call a division? A division, please. Yeah.
Councillor Galloway? Councillor Johansson? No. Councillor Turner?
No.
Councillor McClellan?
Yes.
Councillor Goff?
Yes.
Councillor McDonald?
No.
Councillor Kewen?
Yes.
Councillor Cotter?
Yes.
Councillor Davidson?
No.
Councillor Scandrett?
No.
Councillor Coker?
Yes.
Councillor Templeton?
No.
Councillor Daniels?
No.
Councillor Chen?
No.
Yeah, it's 5 for and 9 against.
Thank you very much. That is lost. So we'll move to the foreshadowed motion, which is option 2, so that we approve $600,000 for this one. So there will be a couple of no's. So I will say all of those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against? No. Would you two like that recorded? Yes, please. Okay. So councillors McDonald and Daniels. You're no? Okay. That's fine. So that one's carried, and we move